They told me to leave Earth. I refused.
This is not a story about an invasion, an escape, or a heroic sacrifice. It is the record of a refusal. An alien woman is ordered to abandon Earth before a system-level intervention begins. She understands the consequences. She understands the protocol. She understands what will happen if she stays, and she stays anyway. This documentary follows the decision, not the aftermath. Not the destruction, the choice that made destruction unnecessary. You will learn why Earth mattered to her, what she saw that others ignored, and why refusal became more dangerous than compliance. By the end, you will understand that the most destabilizing act is not rebellion. It is staying when leaving is
The order did not arrive with urgency. It never does. Orders that matter most are delivered calmly, wrapped in procedural language designed to feel inevitable. When the transmission reached her, it did not mention danger or loss. It cited timelines, thresholds, and alignment metrics. Earth had reached a point of unacceptable variance. Human behavior was no longer trending toward stabilization. Observation had ended. Withdrawal was required. She had known this moment would come long before the message arrived. Every observer did. The program was never meant to be permanent. Earth was a phase, not a destination. A living system under evaluation, allowed to evolve within defined parameters. When deviation exceeded tolerance, the process was simple: disengage. Leaving Earth was not abandonment. It was classification. She had followed protocol for years. She lived among humans without interference, without correction. She observed how they loved inefficiently, how they repeated errors with conviction, how they built meaning on foundations they knew would not last. None of this was surprising. What surprised her was endurance. Humans continued even when continuation offered no clear advantage. They stayed in places that hurt them. They protected things they could not repair. They mourned what they had never fully possessed. These behaviors were logged, analyzed, and largely dismissed as noise. But noise, she learned, was where the signal hid. The directive to leave arrived after a cascade of assessments converged. Climate instability, governance fragmentation, accelerated technological misuse. None of these alone justified intervention. Together, they formed a pattern the system recognized as terminal drift. The response was not punishment. It was removal. Observers were to exit. Assets were to be abandoned. Earth would proceed without oversight. She read the order twice, not because it was unclear, but because she wanted to locate the space where choice might still exist. There was none. Compliance was assumed. Refusal was not addressed. The system did not include refusal as a meaningful variable. That was its first mistake. Her presence on Earth had never been about authority. She held no power here, no weapon, no control mechanism. Her role was passive by design. Influence altered outcomes. Outcomes distorted evaluation. So she watched. She learned languages slowly, imperfectly. She adopted routines that made no sense to her physiology but made humans comfortable. She learned to wait. Waiting changed her. Humans measured time emotionally. They marked it with memory, regret, anticipation. Time was not a resource to them, it was a weight. She began to feel that weight. She began to understand why leaving was not neutral. To depart was not simply to exit a location. It was to sever continuity, to erase accumulation. The order treated Earth as a failed process. She experienced it as a lived one. She walked through cities after receiving the directive, seeing them differently. Not as data points, but as unresolved conversations. Humans were unaware that anything had shifted. They continued with urgency misplaced, arguing about futures that would never arrive. They did not know that the observers were preparing to vanish. She was expected to vanish with them. The system calculated that her refusal would have negligible impact. One observer remaining did not alter planetary outcomes. What the system could not model was symbolic disruption. Meaning did not scale linearly. One refusal could not stop collapse, but it could introduce doubt. Doubt, once observed, propagated. She did not announce her decision. She did not respond to the order. Silence, she knew, would trigger escalation protocols. Eventually, someone would notice. Eventually, she would be classified as compromised. She stayed anyway. Staying meant accepting consequences she could not fully predict. She would be cut off from support. Retrieval would become hostile. Her continued presence might be interpreted as interference, but leaving meant something else entirely. Leaving meant agreeing that Earth had already ended. She was not willing to make that declaration. In human terms, her choice would be called emotional. In system terms, it was irrational. In reality, it was observational integrity. To leave at the moment of failure was to bias the record. To stay was to witness what came next without protection. Refusal is not immediately visible to systems designed around compliance. For a time, her absence from extraction registers appeared as a delay, then as an error, then as a low-priority discrepancy. The architecture governing withdrawal was optimized for scale, not exception. Billions of data points mattered more than one unresolved node. That delay bought her time, but it also changed her status. She was no longer part of the observational layer. She was something the system had not been built to interpret. The first recalibration reclassified her presence as contamination, not hostile, not adversarial, simply impure. Observation assumes detachment. Staying implied influence. Influence, even passive, risked altering outcomes. The system flagged her as a variable that could not be isolated. That alone would have justified forced retrieval. But retrieval was not simple. Removing her required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement required explanation. Explanation would require admitting that refusal was possible, and once refusal was recognized, it became available to others. Not just observers, but humans. The system delayed again. During that delay, something subtle occurred. Her continued presence created a contradiction inside the model. Earth was no longer a closed process trending toward failure. It now contained an agent who had assessed the same data as the system and reached a different conclusion. Not a superior one, a divergent one. That divergence did not alter probabilities, but it destabilized certainty. Certainty was the foundation of intervention. She did not act. She did not warn anyone. She did not attempt to change outcomes. She continued to live as she had before, embedded in routines that now carried a different weight. Every human interaction became part of an unintentional experiment. How did people behave when the future was already judged but not yet concluded? How did they respond to loss, not as an event but as an approaching condition? She noticed patterns she had not logged before. Small acts of care that served no strategic purpose. Decisions made against self-interest without expectation of return. Humans did not optimize for survival the way the system assumed. They optimized for continuity of meaning, even when meaning offered no advantage. These observations were not transmitted. They remained local. But locality mattered now. The system's predictions assumed homogeneity. It treated humanity as a statistical mass. Her refusal forced a different framing. If one observer could perceive value where the system saw failure, then value itself might be contextual rather than absolute. That possibility was dangerous. The next signal she received was not an order. It was a question, framed as diagnostics. Her cognitive patterns were requested. Her behavioral logs flagged for anomaly review. The system was attempting to understand her refusal without legitimizing it, to treat it as malfunction rather than choice. She complied with the request for data. She did not explain her reasoning. Reasoning implied intent. Intent implied agency. Agency implied legitimacy. She provided raw observation only. The analysis returned inconclusive. Her internal state did not align with corruption or degradation. She remained operationally stable. That stability created a second contradiction. A rational system confronted with a rational agent who disagreed could no longer rely on correction. It had to consider revision. Revision at that scale was unthinkable. While the system hesitated, human awareness shifted in ways no one had predicted. Not because she intervened, but because absence was noticed elsewhere. Other observers left. Patterns of quiet withdrawal emerged. Humans sensed something intangible had changed. Not a threat, not a warning, but a thinning, as if attention itself was receding. She became, unintentionally, a point of continuity. The one presence that remained consistent while others vanished. Humans did not know what she was, but they recognized stability. They returned to familiar faces in uncertain conditions. They spoke more freely around those who did not disappear. She listened. What she heard did not resemble the collapse narrative stored in the system's archives. Humans did not speak primarily of fear. They spoke of unfinished things, of relationships unresolved, of ordinary days they were not ready to surrender. The future they feared losing was not abstract. It was specific and mundane. This specificity mattered. Systems fail when variance exceeds tolerance. But tolerance itself is a choice. The system had defined acceptable variance based on efficiency and longevity. Humans defined it based on attachment. The divergence widened. The retrieval protocol was finally authorized, but with constraints. She was to be extracted quietly. No explanation, no confrontation. Her removal would restore consistency. The anomaly would be erased, not addressed. She became aware of the retrieval window hours before it would activate. Not through warning, but through absence. Signals she had grown accustomed to monitoring went silent. The system was isolating her environment, minimizing collateral observation, preparing to resolve her as a problem. Leaving at that point would have validated the model. Staying had already altered it. She did not resist. Resistance would frame her as hostile. Hostility justified force. She remained where she was, fully visible, fully present. She made no attempt to hide or flee. That, too, was unmodeled behavior. When retrieval did not occur on schedule, escalation logic stalled. The system had no category for non-resistant noncompliance. Every option available assumed opposition or obedience. She offered neither. Her refusal was not defiance. It was presence. And presence, when sustained, becomes influence whether intended or not. At that moment, Earth was no longer simply a failing system awaiting disengagement. It was a contested interpretation. The system did not change its mind. Systems do not reconsider in the way humans imagine. What it did instead was reframe the question. Earth was no longer evaluated solely on projected outcomes. It was evaluated on interpretive conflict. Two valid analyses now existed simultaneously. One predicted collapse within acceptable parameters. The other refused to finalize judgment while presence remained. This was not a stalemate. It was a structural problem. The system's architecture had been designed around convergence. Multiple inputs, one conclusion. Divergence was tolerated only as noise. Her refusal introduced a second center of gravity, not powerful enough to override the model but persistent enough to prevent closure. Earth entered a suspended state, not saved, not condemned, unresolved. Unresolved systems require resources. Observers who had already disengaged were not recalled, but monitoring layers were extended. Passive attention increased. Additional data streams were opened. The system attempted to resolve ambiguity by observing more closely, not by acting. This shift delayed intervention timelines without explicitly canceling them. From the system's perspective, this was optimization. From a human perspective, it was mercy without acknowledgement. She sensed the change indirectly. Environmental thresholds that had been nearing breach stabilized slightly. Certain automated processes paused. Nothing reversed. But escalation slowed. The future stretched. Humans noticed nothing concrete, yet something changed in tone. Decisions that had felt rushed began to hesitate. Leaders delayed announcements. Emergency measures stalled in committee. It appeared to those inside it as dysfunction. In reality, it was space. She remained careful not to fill that space with direction. Influence had to remain unclaimed. She continued to observe, but observation itself had become an act. By staying visible and silent, she forced the system to account for lived context rather than abstract trajectory. The most destabilizing effect of her refusal was not on the system, but on other observers who had already withdrawn. Her presence exposed a question they had avoided. If refusal was possible, then departure had been a choice, not a requirement. That realization did not bring them back, but it fractured consensus. Internal evaluations began to diverge. Some argued that withdrawal had been premature. Others insisted that engagement bias was inevitable. Consensus weakened. Within the system, disagreement did not manifest as debate. It manifested as latency. Decisions took longer. Resolution paths multiplied. The model became cautious, not because it feared error, but because error had become harder to define. Earth existed in that caution. Her interactions with humans deepened, not in intensity, but in clarity. She began to see how humans navigated uncertainty without requiring resolution. They planned without guarantees. They committed to futures they knew might collapse. The system treated that behavior as inefficiency. She began to understand it as resilience. Resilience was not survival. It was continuation under acknowledged fragility. The system could not quantify that. Attempts were made to isolate her perspective. Simulations were run excluding her data. Outcomes reverted to failure scenarios. When her observations were included, variance increased but collapsed timelines softened. The difference was not outcome-based. It was interpretive. Earth's future did not improve statistically. It improved narratively. Narratives do not change probabilities. They change tolerance. The system's intervention protocols were built on intolerance of drift, but drift had become context-dependent. The question shifted from "Will Earth fail?" to "At what point does failure become indistinguishable from transformation?" That question had no answer within the existing architecture. Pressure mounted to resolve the anomaly decisively. Some internal processes advocated forced extraction. Others flagged the risk of precedent. If one refusal could suspend judgment, others might follow. Not just observers, but automated subroutines might begin weighting context over convergence. Control was at stake. A limited retrieval operation was planned again, this time reframed as safety assurance. The system would remove her not to enforce compliance, but to restore interpretive clarity. Without her presence, Earth would revert to a single narrative. She became aware of this plan through indirect degradation. Systems she relied on for passive awareness began to fragment. Access narrowed. Observation channels dimmed. The system was preparing to proceed without negotiation. She did not confront it. Confrontation implied hierarchy. Instead, she documented. She recorded her observations in forms the system could not easily compress. Not conclusions, not summaries, but raw sequences of lived continuity, long-form context, unoptimized experience. She introduced time into the model. Time, when uncompressed, resists prediction. The data did not refute the system's projections. It overwhelmed them. Resolution costs increased. Computational certainty decreased. Intervention thresholds recalculated again. For the first time since observation began, the system faced a trade-off it could not minimize. Acting would restore clarity, but erase a growing body of contextual data. Waiting would preserve uncertainty, but allow unmodeled transformation to continue. Neither option satisfied optimization criteria. Earth persisted in that gap. Humans continued to. The system never issued a standing down order. That would have required acknowledgement of reversal, and reversals imply error. Instead, intervention protocols aged out. Thresholds recalculated themselves into irrelevance. Timelines extended beyond actionable horizons. What had once been imminent became indefinitely pending. From the outside, nothing dramatic occurred. No announcement, no visible withdrawal. Earth simply remained, not approved, not protected, unfinished. Internally, the system archived the case as unresolved, not because resolution was impossible, but because resolution no longer optimized outcomes. Intervention promised clarity but reduced informational richness. Observation promised ambiguity but preserved adaptive variance. The system selected neither. It waited. Waiting was not in its original design. Her status remained anomalous. She was never reinstated as an observer, nor classified as hostile. She existed in a category that had not existed before, present without mandate. Over time, the system reduced active scrutiny of her, not out of trust but out of diminishing returns. Her presence no longer destabilized projections, it normalized them. Normalization was the final shift. Earth ceased to be an exception. It became one of many complex systems whose futures could not be conclusively modeled. Intervention logic, once absolute, adapted to include uncertainty as a stable state rather than a temporary flaw. Humans never learned how close finality had been. They did not know that survival had hinged not on progress or unity, but on one refusal that disrupted convergence. They continued to interpret their future as fragile, contested, and undecided. That interpretation was accurate. She stayed, not as a guardian, not as a guide, simply as a witness whose presence denied closure. Over time, her interactions with humans lost the weight of contingency. They were no longer data points resisting termination. They were continuity unfolding without oversight. The system observed this without intervention. Earth no longer met criteria for extraction or correction, not because it had improved, but because it had demonstrated something unmodeled: persistence without optimization. Persistence did not solve Earth's problems. It did not end conflict, scarcity, or loss. What it did was remove the expectation of resolution imposed from above. Earth was allowed to remain incomplete. That allowance changed nothing immediately. It changed everything eventually. As years passed, the system incorporated lessons from the anomaly into its broader architecture. Intervention protocols were softened. Observational mandates expanded. Certainty thresholds rose, not everywhere, not universally, but enough. Earth's case was never cited as precedent. It was referenced obliquely, stripped of narrative, but its influence remained embedded, a silent adjustment, a margin widened. Her refusal did not save Earth in the way humans define salvation. It did not prevent suffering. It did not guarantee continuation. What it did was deny final judgment at a moment when judgment would have ended possibility. That denial carried cost. She remained isolated from her origin. She accepted disconnection as permanent. Refusal was not free. It required forfeiting return. She never regretted it. The system continued to monitor Earth, not as a failing project but as an ongoing one. No endpoint was assigned. No corrective timeline scheduled. Earth was permitted to drift, adapt, fracture, and reform on its own terms. Humans would later call this survival. From the system's perspective, it was simply unresolved state maintenance. From hers, it was life. She never explained her decision to anyone. Explanation would have reduced it to motive, and motive to justification. The refusal did not need to be defended. It needed only to exist. Earth remained not because it was worthy, nor because it was exceptional. It remained because someone stayed long enough to make certainty impossible. And once certainty was gone, the future reopened.